The fact that teachers can issue fines against parents and get so much control over children's lives is extreme. And the fact that nobody talks about this casual extremism shows just how insulated so many of our friends have become, especially our Anglo friends, in comparison to the global norm. Meanwhile, you have professors who propose mass suicide as solutions, literally, not figuratively. The fact that such individuals are allowed to continue to hold a position of public trust is more evidence of the extremism of academia. For all the talk about the threat of extremism lately, we still don't have enough conversations about falsely mainstreamized, genuine extremism. You are told to be threatened by young people voting to curb immigration, apparently that's extremism these days, or by young people finally waking up and no longer subscribing to the dogshit idea that hard, endless, meaningless work is inherently a good thing. But you're never invited to reflect upon the casual extremism of the dorks who pretend to be our elites. So, a bit of this and that is what we're going to do in this episode of Periodic Insanity. Hello everyone and welcome to the 32nd edition of Periodic Insanity. Now, it's been a long while since I made an episode of this series, almost 5 years in fact. The reason being that, well, life happened and also I was no longer satisfied with the format. Still, that doesn't mean the format can't be changed, so this is an attempt. Not sure it will work out, but occasionally I still stumble upon straight up crazy news that is worth discussing. And it's in fact better to discuss it after a while has passed. So basically, I picked slightly older news, mostly, to comment for the general phenomenon rather than the specifics of the piece of news, which I used to do in the past. Oh, and there was also in the meantime the World So Far Report series that also pretty much acted as a periodic insanity for a while. But the thing is that such discussions are far more common now than they were 8 or 9 years ago, albeit with a lot of trade-offs. So that also contributed to lower motivation to continue the old format. Anyway, so with that, let's go to the first one. Daily Mail: angry father fined after taking his 13-year-old son on holiday during term time, sends teachers a demand they pay him for the lessons missed due to strike days. Quote, "A furious father has fined his son's teachers for going on strike after he was hit with a £240 penalty for taking his family on holiday during term time. Stephen Doherty, 44, lashed out after he was penalized for taking his son Alfie, a pupil at St. Ambrose Barlow RC whatever in Greater Manchester, on holiday. Mr. Doherty had booked a getaway for the Easter break, but claims he didn't realize term times differed depending on the school, insisting the holiday mix-up had been an innocent mistake. Now the father of 5 has slammed the hypocritical stance of allowing teachers to go on strike last Wednesday in a move he says broke the same attendance rules he was penalized for. Sending off his tongue-in-cheek email, the fuming mechanic fined 2 of Alfie's teachers £120 each for joining the picket last week instead of being in lessons. He even included his payment details and a deadline of February the 14th, unquote. Now the rest of the article just goes on to describe the details, which are quite frankly uninteresting. The comment section also just argues in the narrow paradigm of whether the angry father has a point and that the teacher strike is kinda bollocks, or whether the teachers decide the fines or someone else does. Yes, I know the local council does usually. But nobody stops to think about the inherent extremism and quite frankly mental illness of the very idea of fining parents for taking their kids on vacation. The very idea is bonkers. So I tried to look it up to see if anyone else is equally insane, at least in Europe. And the Euronews article from March 2024, trying really hard not to say the UK and Germany are the only insane places, ends up doing just that, because once you read the fine print, you realize that basically nobody else is that insane, regardless of what the books say. Oh yeah, and Austria, because we're still pretending that's a separate place. I mean, in France, to pull something like this requires the Minister of Education to personally go and file a case in court, which takes so much to litigate that your kid will literally graduate by the time the final appeal is decided, and that's assuming the courts won't tell the fine minister to go pound sand, which they usually do in administrative courts. In fact, every single example that is not Germany, Austria, and the United Kingdom is basically, yeah, that's kind of haram, but nobody cares. Even terminally totalitarian Norway, known for state abuse and kidnap of children through their semi-private child trafficking agency Barnevernet, even they are less insane on this topic than the United Kingdom and, yes, Germany. And still, the question remains, since when does the local council know better than me, the parent, when it is appropriate to go on vacation? The whole idea is madness. Heck, even if you believe that the state should have a say in some parental matters, I don't, but even if you do, it is still moronic to ticket parents for something like this. The state's own jurisprudence about the best interests of the child should be good enough to challenge this, and usually is, but not in the United Kingdom. How the hell is it in the best interest of the child to make his parents poorer for something that quite literally doesn't matter? And no, please spare me with this nonsense. Quite literally, nothing happens if a kid skips 2 weeks of school. Any 2 weeks, nothing happens. And only members of one of the top 5 most useless classes on earth, that would be public school teachers, would claim otherwise. I mean, I skipped a year and a half, and still nothing happened. And I would have skipped more if I could, but the bureaucracy was getting a little bit tough. Still, this is the truly insane part. The extensive and never-ending privileges that are awarded to an overwhelmingly useless class of people. Most public school teachers are far dumber than a rock and lack the decency and common sense that are far more prevalent among the so-called less educated. I mean, a mechanic, like the father in the story I just read, is always more trustworthy than a public school teacher. And after all, it's not mechanics that sexually assault children at shocking rates. It's precisely those precious teachers whom some societies have gone completely mad and now empower them to fine parents. Ironically, those same societies then wonder why their fertility rates are plummeting. But more on that in another video series. Meanwhile, since I bashed teachers, maybe it's time to bash some parents too. The New York Post. Teachers fed up with 11-year-old kids wearing diapers in school. Worrying trend. Quote, if your kid shows up to play on an iPad, they should know how to use the loo. Teachers in Switzerland are complaining about too many students wearing diapers in class because they don't know how to use the toilet. Kids are going to school as early as 4-year-old now, so yeah, you might actually find some still in diapers, says Dagmar Rösler, head of the Swiss Federation of Teachers for the Swiss newspaper 20 Minuten. When 11-year-olds come to school in diapers, that's a worrying trend. Many tots have become so accustomed to wearing diapers that they lose interest in transitioning out of the convenient but unsanitary method. The average age to potty train children is between 18 months and 24 months, according to Mayo Clinic, but many parents seem to be avoiding the training session. Kids wearing diapers in school has skyrocketed, child development expert Rita Messmer told the Sonntagszeitung, revealing she had an 11-year-old patient who wasn't taught how to use the toilet on their own. The children's lack of knowledge becomes a burden for many teachers who have to assist students with soaked diapers. To be fair, the teachers deserved it. While the problem is rampant in Switzerland, reports have emerged from Buffalo, New York, that parents there have failed to teach their children how to use the toilet. Unquote. And this, my friends, is another reason why I can't take lamentations about fertility and birth rates too seriously. I mean, I was having this conversation with 2 recent parents about how parents put childish names to their kids, completely oblivious to the fact that their purpose as parents is to raise functional adults, and calling your son a diminutive is far from a good thing. Well, this is just next level. When your 11-year-old can't go to the loo by himself, you as a parent have failed. It It's really that simple. The 11-year-olds whose education I'm involved in navigate not just the city, but the county or sometimes the country alone. This is unthinkable to some Westerners and especially unthinkable to Americans, but this is in fact quite normal in most of Europe. Well, I guess not in Switzerland, which really doesn't surprise me. I mean, Switzerland is that place where they apply the World Health Organization standards on sexual education by teaching pornography to 11-year-olds. But I do wonder if they teach them to take away their diapers first. Okay, that was a bit mean. I get it. But the fact remains that the more infantilized our societies become, the more insane and idiosyncratic our societal practices become. I mean, think about it this way. This February 2024, the Swiss Federal Council seriously considered lowering the voting age to 16. Now, the proposal eventually failed, but just think about it. The society where some perfectly healthy 11-year-olds wear diapers and haven't mastered the complex art of going to the loo when physiology calls seriously considered that the same people less than 5 years later would get an equal say in how society is run with an army veteran. That, my friends, is crazy. And no amount of sugarcoating and problematizing lingo is going to change that. Now, sure, in the grand scheme of things, you may think this is no big deal. And yes, by itself, this piece of news is no big deal. However, once we take it into its full context, it's suddenly a big deal. I mean, just check out any parents group online. I mean, if you can withstand it. I mean, I did, and I started empathizing with anti-natalists a lot more. No, seriously. I mean, the ideas that people hold about children and parenthood in so many affluent societies these days are so extreme and so insane that it becomes reasonable to hope for an even bigger depression of fertility. If you mention these days that getting out at 10 a.m. and only coming back at 10 p.m. during summertime should in fact be the norm, especially in smaller towns, which Switzerland abounds of, so does the US for that matter, you get odd looks like you just advocated for sending children to the coal mines. And is it any wonder that so many 20-year-olds have the mental age of an 11 at the most? I mean, why wouldn't they? It's also no wonder that the policy follows the practice, because policy is downstream from culture. So a culture that tolerates diapers on 11-year-olds is one that will easily tolerate the extension of legal adolescence or childhood all the way to 26, or even 29 or 34 in the European Union. I'm serious. You can be considered youth all the way till 34 for certain EU programs. So, once we look at this in context, suddenly these little things create what academics call the tyranny of small decisions. By itself, a few diapers at 11 may not be a big deal. But combined with raising kids on a tablet or an iPad, reducing time outside to lower levels than maximum security inmates, check it out seriously, reducing expectations to unthinkable levels merely 20 years ago, that is to say 1 minute ago, civilizationally speaking, all of these things do add up. Anyway, with all of the childishness around us, that still doesn't make the anti-life goblins in American academia more likable. The New York Times. A Yale professor suggested mass suicide for old people in Japan. What did he mean? I'm sorry? I mean, why are we having this conversation? Quote, his pronouncements could hardly sound more drastic. In interviews and public appearances, Yusuke Narita, an assistant professor of economics at Yale, has taken on the question of how to deal with the burden of Japan's rapidly aging society. I feel like the only solution is pretty clear, he said during one online news program in late 21. In the end, isn't it mass suicide and mass seppuku of the elderly? Last year, when asked by a school-age boy to elaborate on his mass seppuku theories, Dr. Narita graphically described to a group of assembled students a scene from Midsommar, a 2019 horror film in which a Swedish cult sends one of its oldest members to commit suicide by jumping off a cliff. Whether that's a good thing or not, that's a more difficult question to answer, Dr. Narita told the questioner as he assiduously scribbled notes. So if you think that's a good, then maybe you can work hard toward creating a society like that. At other times, he has broached the topic of euthanasia. The possibility of making it mandatory in the future, he said in one interview, will come up in discussion. Dr. Narita, age 37, said that his statements had been taken out of context and that he was mainly addressing a growing effort to push the most senior people out of leadership positions in business and politics to make room for younger generations, unquote. Oh yeah, the context. There definitely needs a clarifying context for this, right? You see, in a sane society, this individual would have been taken off in a straitjacket, yes, by force, from his little office at Yale and forcibly admitted into the loony bin for further investigation at the very least. Then Yale would have issued a public communique distancing itself in no uncertain terms from such extremism and pledging to vet its employees better going forward. But this is not a sane society. American academia is many things, but sane is simply not one of them. Now that's not to leave Japan off the hook, mind you. A culture known for its deference to the elderly, but one that somehow forgot to mention that this loony is, well, a loon. It may have something to do with his association to Yusaku Maezawa, or Zozo. I'm sure it comes as a shock to you that in Japan you get to pretty much do whatever you like if you're associated with the correct family or the correct billionaire. For all the propaganda about the alleged Japanese or East Asian correctness, in reality this has always been the case. Japan is a very corrupt country. And minor TV celebrities have in the past included a literal cannibal who ate a French woman. And I'm not joking. Look up Issei Sagawa if you don't believe me. Point being clinically insane in public while also being part of the correct circle is widely tolerated both in Japan and in the United States. The criteria differs. In the US, it's not enough to be rich. You also have to be in the correct favor with the correct institutions. So this loon being associated with Yale helps a lot. You can rest assured that if he had been associated with the Republican Party, you would have heard a lot more about him, and not in such neutral terms. Still, I believe we are at least a decade away from even having this conversation about the macabre extremism that is in fact the norm in the academia. But hey, maybe I'm too pessimistic. One by one, more and more employers, including big ones, have straight up dropped their college requirements as more and more people figure it out that having gone to college is in fact no guarantee of anything most of the time. And in some cases, having been to college is in fact a guarantee of extremism and dogshit ideas. So my video from 8 years ago, Abandon Universities, is slowly becoming true, because that seems to be the difference between the sofa and real news, I suppose. And to tie it with the previous topic, this is yet another idiosyncrasy. Kids are too fragile to get them off diapers earlier, but they're not too fragile to be exposed to extremist loons who think it's a debate on whether we should structure society based on a Swedish horror movie that involves a mass suicidal cult. You see, it's just too difficult to answer whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's all relative, man. Well, it's all relative unless it's about promoting abnormality and degeneracy. Then it's suddenly not all relative, and in fact it is an objective good thing. The New York Times: can Japan's first same-sex dating reality show change hearts and minds? You see, suddenly that's not relative. The New York Times just casually repeats that we can't really know whether it's a bad thing to promote mass killing of the elderly, but it's objectively good to promote same-sex dating. But is it? Remember, just a few days ago, several North American cities had the pleasure to see in their downtowns some nice examples of public fellatio from the fine members of the LGBTQP++ so-called community, all while the children were watching. Of course, I can't exactly show it to you because the rest of the world still regards that as pretty bad and compels YouTube to take it down. But in public, in the cities, I guess it's all good. At this point in time, it really is extremism not to notice the direct and uninterrupted correlation between so-called LGBT rights, especially so-called gay marriage, and the rampant increase in public debauchery or degeneracy, and not just tolerance, but encouragement of it too. And it's hard to disagree with conspiracists, including the Russian-funded ones, when they talk about a gay agenda considering shit like this. I mean, seriously, why exactly should Japan tolerate this? What exactly is the problem if Japan sits somewhere in the middle on this issue? Not repressive like Uganda, but also not celebrating any of this like Toronto or San Francisco. And mind you, all of this matters geopolitically too. It's not just an internet culture war issue. This is the part that's not as heavily emphasized as it should be. Our geopolitical enemies are essentially given a pass in front of an empty goal with this, to use an analogy from football, since the European Championship is still ongoing when I'm taping this. It's not that China or Russia are more moral, they're obviously not, but they can, very convincingly, I might add, simply point out that, they are less insane on this issue by simply holding the same legislation, policy, and public culture about these things like 100% of Western countries held in 2001, this century, okay? I mean, seriously, people fail to appreciate just how new this whole thing is. As of 2005, less than 1%, heck, less than 0.5% of the global population lived in a jurisdiction that recognized such lunacy. As of 2024, a bit over 15% of the global population lives under such demented jurisdictions. Mind you, this isn't even very popular even in the places where such legislation exists. And our geopolitical enemies know this very well, which is precisely why they insist. Now again, in a normal world, we'd have an elite that understood this and started thinking about policy that looks at the, yes, superior civilizational interests. Nothing happens if you send the LGBT lobby to pound sand. Seriously, nothing happens. I'll tell you from my own country. The European Court of Human Rights, which by the way we should abandon, says we must recognize this lunacy or else, well, it's not really clear what happens if we say no. And it wasn't clear to the Prime Minister either, so he just said no and that was it. Nobody cared. And as a result, the Russian-funded shills from around here were left without one topic to agitate over, just like that. Oh no, some tankies on Reddit were upset. Who the hell cares? Maybe stop making policy based on online trends. That would help. But no, seriously. Taking back our societies from these extremism is an absolute necessity. And yes, it must be affirmed every time. Shoving down abnormal behavior everywhere is extremism. Public debauchery is extremist. Advocating for the mass suicide of people is extremist. Don't let the extremists shame you into silence. And speaking of Russian-backed extremists, vodhoitashok.hu, a new faction called the Sovereignists is being formed in the European Parliament with Mihozank. So, too long didn't read. Basically, AfD got kicked out from the extremist quote-unquote far-right group because its delegation leader, Maximilian Krach, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, basically was being too much of a psychiatry hospital in his own right in public, even by the already loose standards of the ID group, Identity and Democracy. So now they're making a proper psychiatry hospital group in the European Parliament. Now this Hungarian website is nice enough to just give us the short list rather than long diatribes like I've seen in English language website. So, quote, the following right-wing parties may also join the faction. SOS Romania 2 seats, Spain's Se Acabó la Fiesta 3 seats, Greece's NIHK 1 seat, Poland's Confederația Voldoș 6 seats, Slovak Hnutie Republica 2 seats, and Hungarian Mihozank Movement 1 seat. AfD has 17 seats, unquote. Now, I don't know, I think this is a good thing. Although I put it here in this episode because with the exception of the Spanish party, all the other parties are basically psychiatric patients at this point. Though to be fair, some of them mostly act like psychiatric patients rather than be one themselves. And I say this because I know some of them personally, and their public activity is not congruent to someone being clinically insane. I mean, say what you want about Torotsky Laszlo of Mihozank, but the guy isn't crazy. I mean, he moved from being the mayor of a village with 3,000 people to being in the spotlight of European politics in under 7 years. That is no small thing. Just managing that is pretty hard. Not to mention funding it, which, yes, his friends from Russia took care of. Similarly, the woman from Romania, Diana Șoșoacă, is a classical political chameleon. I mean, she moved from being buddies with the Social Democrats to working for the progressive left, then for the nationalist Aur party, and got kicked from all of those for being too aggressive. So she doubled and tripled down on it, created her own thing, then ended up kicking her own husband from her party, who then ran as an independent against her. I shit you not. And eventually she got 5%, so her own psychiatry hospital, SOS, gets to send 2 people to the European Parliament, herself and the guy known for grifting pertaining to astrology and some tabloid-style TV shows 20 years ago. But wait, there's more. She's also a regular visitor. At this point, I think we can say she's probably the only visitor to the Russian embassy. And apparently she's so bad that everyone else in this forming group of sovereignists voted unanimously against having her in the group. I mean, seriously, this type of insanity is at least funny. I mean, I can't be upset about it, especially given that this outcome shows just how seriously the European Parliament is taken by the electorate, and for good reason. I mean, rule number 1 in politics, the electorate is always correct. It's not a real parliament. It's more like a Supreme Soviet where they just rubber stamp whatever the Commission proposes. They get a taste of real power when they get to veto the budget sometimes, and they rarely do, or when they get to pick the president of the Commission, which they should do this month in July. Also, of course, the European elections are a great occasion for the electorate to mock their own local politician. I mean, this absolutely played a role in these results in Spain, in Poland, in Portugal, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Slovenia not so much, and chief among all, France, of course. The bait that the French electorate threw at Macron is just lovely. And the Jupiterian just straight up threw himself at it. No, it's my bait. That's Macron right there. Now, when I'm recording this, the final results of the French snap elections aren't known, but let's just say it ain't looking good. And finally, to wrap this up, Reuters, how the far right gained traction with Europe's youth. This was the funniest confirmation that could have happened that what I said 6 years ago is true. I mean, in 2018, I made a video called The Alluring Idea of Lowering the Voting Age, in which I argued that most of the reasons presented for it are puerile, pardon the pun, and that those who hope this will increase their voting share may end up being disappointed. Well, it didn't take long for exactly that to happen. Reuters says, quote, young voters traditionally perceived to be more left-wing drove the wave of support for environmental parties at the last EU election in 2019, earning the nickname Generation Greta after the young Swedish climate activist. But following the pandemic, the Ukraine war and cost of living crisis, many shifted their support this year towards far-right populist parties that tapped into their concerns, fueling their overall rise in the June 6 to 9 EU Parliament poll. With the leaders of Europe's often upstart ethno-nationalist anti-establishment movements mastering new social media better than their mainstream counterparts, they are earning a cachet as a subversive counterculture among some young people. Oh, who knew? Being fun is countercultural. What a fucking shock. They appeal in particular to young men who feel left behind and censored in an increasingly woke mainstream, analysts say. Oh, really? So this is the difference between SOFA and the mainstream analysts. 7 years. I mean, I was explaining these things here in 2017. Anyway, a survey of Germany's youth showed that young people were increasingly worried about inflation, expensive housing and social divisions, and less about climate change. Oh no. The Greens won just 11% of the youth vote on Sunday, down 23 percentage points. Still 11% too much. In France, the far-right National Rally took a 25% share of the vote among 18 to 24-year-olds, according to pollster Ipsos, up 10 percentage points compared with an around 8-point gain overall to 31.4%. To be sure, most of the youth in the EU's top two powers still back leftist parties, and many worry about the latest trend. It worries me because I saw the far right wants to deport people even if they have German citizenship like me, says Ensar Adanur, 17, a German of Turkish origin. But Germany is home for me. Well, legally speaking, it's not, though, if your parents aren't citizens and you're not born there. But don't worry, the CDU just changed the citizenship law again, so you'll be fine for a while. In Poland, however, support for the far-right confederation among 18 to 29-year-old voters increased from 18.5% to 30.1%, making them the leading choice for that demographic. Mainstream parties no longer have any credibility for me. The previous government and the current one show it clearly, says Paweł Rulkowski, age 30, an IT specialist who voted for Konfederacja, unquote. So yeah, all of this is just so much fun to watch. And since establishmentarians have shown no indication of genuinely understanding any of this, well, what can I say? Voting for the far right will continue until morale improves. I mean, mind you, the English language media treats all of these parties as if they're somehow the same, or at the very least similar, or part of the same movement, but they're really not. I mean, Confederacja is very capitalist, while the chap from Spain is a lefty. A lot of these parties have economic views that are mostly mainstream center-left or social democrat, not to mention those that have no economic policy at all, besides opposition to set and obvious insanities of the European Union. I mean, out of that long list of the discontent and opposition, the establishmentarians seem to have only understood one: the opposition to the so-called Green Deal. That is now off the table, which of course is a good step in the right direction, but they only got that one right because the line doesn't go up anymore, not because they understood what animates more and more voters to these clown parties. And that is the insanity of our world. In a normal world, parties like SOS, Se Acabó la Fiesta, or Michozang wouldn't pass the threshold. And the establishmentarians aren't making themselves any favors by constantly emphasizing that a lot of them get or have gotten funding from Russia. Yes, they did. But you can have all the funding in the world. If you can't convince people to vote for you, it still won't matter. I mean, a far-left Westoid party here in Romania spent more than both right-wing parties together and barely got 3% and didn't pass the threshold, even though they also mastered social media, even though they ran with the former prime minister and the Brussels insider. I mean, having money and a connected personality on top of your ticket is not everything in politics. Sure, it helps, but only if you know how to spend them, and there is also a real constituency for what you're selling. And this is where we all have a long way to go. These clowns exist because they have a point. And until that changes, they'll keep on coming, Russian funding or not. And shouting that they can't govern won't help either. I mean, if anything, it radicalizes their voters even more. But hey, what do I know about politics? I'm just a regular guy on a sofa. So yeah, I guess that's enough for now. So with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, send me to the cartels in Latin America, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.